This is now a world where AI agents are starting to log in for us as well as doing our work for us, yet our security systems still rely on 1970s era thinking about passwords and factors. When identity can be faked, forged, or hijacked at machine speed, the real question becomes terrifyingly simple. How do we know who or what is actually behind the keyboard? To deal with such frightening prospects, you really need to have ice in your veins. But then again, maybe it's your veins themselves that hold the key to your security. I'm Steve Prentice, and this is the Thales Security Sessions podcast. To help us understand what the future of authentication looks like and where biometrics, behavior, and continuous signals collide with deepfakes, AI agents, and the end of logins as we know it, I sat down recently with Ant Allan, former VP Analyst at Gartner, for a truly in-depth and fascinating conversation. Ant, welcome to the Thales Security Sessions podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Steve. I hope I can provide some value.
Before we get into the mechanics of authentication, I want to zoom out for a second. We are watching AI agents begin to take actions on our behalf, sometimes without us even touching a keyboard, and that feels both exciting and a little unnerving. So when machines start logging in for us, the whole idea of identity and trust seems to shift. So from your vantage point, what's the biggest thing changing right now, and what should we be paying attention to?
The thing that I would highlight is that we are in a period of rapid change. The way we interact with computer systems is changing, and what we can do with computers is changing the way we interact. We have things like artificial intelligence, nobody logging in anymore because artificial intelligence agents would do everything for them. And that kind of raises all kinds of questions around, well, how do you know who the person is in the first place? There's got to be some kind of login. And how can you trust a particular AI agent is acting on somebody's behalf? I think there's a kind of bootstrapping problem. We're doing all these wonderful things with new technologies, but how do we get back to the basis of trust to know that the human actor at the beginning of the chain is who they claim to be, and that authenticated identity is propagated through agents of some kind, whether it's artificial intelligence or other, that are trustworthy. We need to understand how identity can propagate. And we've had that problem since we started doing federation between systems decades ago, but it becomes new again in discussions around AI agents and such like, and using technologies like OpenID to propagate those things. Is that up to the task, or is it mired in the past?
A key topic of yours that really resonates with me is the idea that so much of our security thinking is still anchored in models from the 70s and the 80s. We're still counting factors like it's a checklist, even though attackers have evolved far beyond that. Can you walk us through why this factor counting mindset is no longer enough? And what's fundamentally flawed about the way we have been framing authentication for decades?
And it is one of the issues that came up in a recent conversation on LinkedIn about how we propagate trust down the chain. And it comes back to, is this good enough? And say, well, if you look at the specification, what you see is something that is kind of trying to do the right things. But like a lot of thinking about user authentication, it goes back to a very coarse-grained model that is fixed on ideas like specific assurance levels or specific authentication technologies. And a lot of the thinking around user authentication is still framed in this 1970s model of having three authentication factors. You've got this notion that counting factors, having two-factor authentication is better than single factor, having three-factor is ostensibly better than two. It's counting factors is seen as a good thing. And there's so many regulations that say you must have two factors, two of these three factors. And it's going back to this 1970s model. Is this still relevant. It's still the best way of doing things. And we know in practice that different authentication factors, different kinds of authentication methods have different strengths and weaknesses. Now we're seeing some regulations really hitting on that, specifically asking for phishing-resistant authentication methods. Some regulations are being more specific about the robustness of the methods that they're looking for. But it's still framed in this decades-old way. And the mainstream example is still based on a 1980s model within this 70s formalism. In the 80s, we saw the first one-time password tokens emerge. And this idea of adding a one-time password token to an existing password to give you multi-factor authentication, it defined multi-factor authentication for a generation and is still broadly the way most organizations are looking at things. And we know passwords are flawed. We're throwing this extra authentication factor on top of passwords to create multi-factor authentication to give us more trust. Is that actually the best way of doing things? Passwords are so mired in a variety of flaws and different exploits that the value they bring to the multi-factor authentication is minimal. So you're really relying on that second factor. And you got to think, if we started from scratch and said, is there a single factor authentication method that would actually be far better than a password? We wouldn't need a second factor. And for some lower levels of risk, then that might be appropriate. And there are some issues around attacks with deepfakes and so on, but biometric authentication is a potential candidate. And maybe not face, which is where deepfake attacks have become notorious. There are ways of dealing with that, minimizing the risk, but there are other kinds of biometric methods where in certain circumstances that might work better. We've got vein technologies in the hand or the finger, which don't seem to lend themselves to deepfake type attacks. They're more specialized, but in some circumstances, that might be an appropriate authentication method. And I would say I would intuitively trust a method based on infrared sensing of veins in the hand as a single factor mechanism more than I would trust a method that combines a legacy password with out-of-band SMS, for example. So saying two-factor is stronger than one-factor isn't necessarily always the case. It depends on the particular methods you're using. But that's still ingrained, and the idea of using a token plus a password is still so ingrained that a lot of organizations are reluctant to move away from that.
I've noticed that when organizations talk about going passwordless, they often mean we're removing the password without really understanding what fills that gap. It does become kind of like a marketing term rather than a strategy. So from your experience, what do people get wrong about passwordless authentication? And what should they actually be thinking about when they say they want to move in that direction?
One of the things that I used to come across talking with clients when they wanted to discuss passwordless authentication was this idea that you were just doing without the password and there wasn't the understanding of what went in its place. It was a good marketing hook, if you like. But if you're saying, I want to implement passwordless authentication, then it wasn't really telling you what you were going to do. It didn't say anything about what you were actually using. So I think passwordless is good as an introductory idea, but when you're thinking about how do we achieve passwordless authentication, what is taking the place, quote unquote, of passwords in our authentication methods is important. And that leads into a much broader discussion because there are many ways that you can do without passwords. And in fact, the thing I used to present was if we take that traditional categorization, there are these varieties of knowledge-based methods, there are these varieties of tokens, there are these varieties of biometric methods. Everything except the password is passwordless. It's getting away from, if we're not using a password, what do we use instead? And then you've got the idea of a decision about identity on. The way technology has moved has given us tools where we can actually fold far more pieces of evidence, if you like, into a decision about identity.
You mentioned biometrics like vein recognition and continuous ECG monitoring. I have to admit that sounds like something out of science fiction, kind of Isaac Asimov or Blade Runner type stuff. At the same time, it's incredibly compelling from a usability standpoint. But people always worry about privacy, of course, and about their bodies becoming even like corporate credentials. So how do you see biometrics fitting into the future of authentication? And where do they genuinely offer advantages over old password plus token models?
It is real. And there are things, very specialized things. Many people in the industry will have come across the Canadian company NYMI, NYMI. Mm-hmm. And they have a wristband, a wearable, that monitors your ECG. And I think now it's actually fingerprint enabled. So when you put it on in the first place, you've got to activate it with your fingerprint. But then, as long as it's on your wrist, it's continuously monitoring your ECG and say, yes, I'm still on Steve's wrist or Ant's wrist. And then it enables a PKI-based mechanism. So it essentially functions like a smart card. In terms of interfaces with computer systems. There's nothing inherently novel required on the back end. It works just through the standard smart card interfaces, as far as I understand. But the key is it's on your wrist. It just needs to be in proximity with the computer to be able to log you in. Once you've activated it at the beginning of the day until you take it off, it's always active. And it's not a cheap technology, but there are some use cases where that is very effective, not just for a matter of user convenience, but also in terms of environments where people are unable to handle conventional types of authentication tokens, or where interacting with computers, inserting a smart card, whatever, would be problematic. So thinking in technology clean rooms in pharmaceutical companies, that kind of environment where people are wearing protective equipment, that works very well. But it's not a generalizable solution. The vein technologies is something we've seen in healthcare for several years, and a number of manufacturers, including Hitachi and Fujitsu, have solutions here. It's a technology which runs expensive compared to some of the mainstream solutions, but this has seen adoption in clinical environments, in healthcare and the like, where the sensors are able to work through medical gloves using infrared. There's no touch involved, and it has advantages there. So I think there are some interesting possibilities for biometric technologies, not just the user experience point of view, but the practicalities of the environment. But they are more expensive, so they only really scale in those specialist areas. But the idea of using biometrics at all, I think, is an interesting challenge, because there are two parts to this. One is the privacy regulations. What do organizations have to do to justify using biometric methods? What do they have to do to protect the data? Which I always thought was a bit of a non-problem, or it wasn't a problem specific to the privacy regulation. Because if you have any kind of data that you're using as credentials, you want to protect that as best you can. And so meeting that part of the privacy regulations shouldn't be a challenge, because you should be protecting that as well as you could anyway. I think a lot of people are wary about where the legislation applies. They're wary about running foul of it, and that's been an inhibitor. But practically, it's something that is very advantageous from a user experience point of view. And I think nowadays, the vast majority of people with any kind of phone or tablet are using biometrics to unlock the devices perfectly happily. If you say, okay, well, it's not just the device now, my organization is going to be using this, then that might raise more issues about, am I comfortable with this anymore? Because who's looking after the data? What are they going to use it for? People might be more averse. But I think just having experience of using biometric methods on personal devices has changed a lot of attitudes to the broader adoption of biometrics anyway. People are more comfortable with it. There are those that still might have privacy concerns, which you've got to be wary of. But I think that's significantly shifted people's attitudes towards it. The other thing, of course, we're seeing now, and it goes back to discussion about different options for passwordless authentication and what FIDO Alliance has been doing. If people are happy using the biometrics on their device, then that can be part of a broader solution for the enterprise, where it's still just the biometric method on the device, and all the data is still just stored on the device rather than in the organization centrally, where you can use that biometric method as a user gesture to unlock the passkeys on the device, whether that's the passkeys implemented in the device operating systems, or whether you have some kind of proprietary solution which has device-bound passkeys on mobile devices, which we've seen, I think, from Microsoft RSA now at least. And I think that is a potential strong model for the future in leveraging FIDO within enterprises without the need to issue hardware devices to everyone, which has always been a barrier in terms of cost and logistics and so on. So I think the biometrics may not be something we always use as a primary authentication method, but being able to exploit the device native biometrics on the device with its privacy preserving features as part of a broader authentication solution, I think is probably where we're going to see most use of biometrics in enterprise, workforce, and consumer use cases.
I see a split amongst the population between those who recognize the absolute convenience of this because how tedious it is to have to deal with security on a personal level, and then the other side who see this as a gross imposition on their personal self. I mean, this is somatic here. This is a matter of using your body as a device, and some might say as a corporate tool because it's, you're using it for security. However, as we know, the weakest link in all of cybersecurity still is the human who falls for phishing and social engineering emails and so on. This is all seemingly positive stuff. Do you anticipate, however, because this is the continual cat and mouse game we have in security, with the other side being incredibly fiendishly brilliant at knocking down anything that we build, do you anticipate that this could also be prone to fraud or, again, deepfake reconstruction of veins or other kinds of physical characteristics? Are there weaknesses to this particular argument?
I've told everyone that I've dealt with over the years, particularly vendors who come up with new authentication methods, don't say it's bulletproof. So many people have, and they say, no, you cannot anticipate every potential attack. I think the question is understanding the threat model with all of these methods. The way to think about it is to understand the potential difficulty. So yes, we've got a theoretical attack against this method, but given the way it's implemented, what are the potential attack vectors? What is the technical challenge for an attacker? What are the logistics around this? So it's like, for example, the difference between passwords and PINs. We know passwords are flawed. We know there are multiple ways that passwords can be compromised. They really stem from the way passwords are used, that there's a centralized store which can be compromised. Passwords are transmitted, passwords are entered online. There are various ways of capturing them. So we say, well, passwords are a bad idea. And then we go, okay, we've got FIDO2 security keys, which are PIN protected, which looks very much like a password to me. But the kernel here is that the PIN is completely local to the device. So it's still possible to use shoulder surfing. You can see what PIN somebody is typing in, but you're reducing the potential pathways available to an attacker. So with biometric methods, if you're using something which relies on a camera on a device and you're capturing something, how can that be compromised? How can people insert deep fake? How can they do an injection attack and so forth? So you've got to think about the complexities of that. If you implement something in a particular instance, for example, in that clinical environment using vein recognition, pattern recognition software, then that's much more complicated technical environment. Attackers have physically present in that environment to be able to compromise that, et cetera, et cetera. So the risks are different. More broadly, and for most organizations using authentication generally for general users, employees, workforce, or customers, then the key has always been that we don't rely on a single thing. I'm walking back a little what I said before about single-factor authentication might be good enough in some circumstances. It still might be. But more broadly, the more things that you can evaluate, the less dependent you are on any single thing. So if one thing is compromised, you've still got other things to rely on.
I love the way you frame authentication as a truth claim. Essentially, someone saying, I am who I say I am, and the system weighing the evidence. That's much richer of a way to think about identity than just passwords or tokens. Can you expand on how behavioral signals, device identity, and contextual clues like that can help build that evidence? And why are they becoming essential to modern authentication?
This is probably a good segue into the idea that there is more to user authentication nowadays than those traditional three factors. There are many systems which have, over the past 10, 20 years, incorporated other kinds of signals into the authentication process. And one of the challenges is this still authentication, or is this something else? And a lot of organizations, I think, are looking at this through a lens of it's something else and not bringing it back to the question of, is this giving me confidence in that identity claim, which is the core idea of user authentication. And this gets a bit philosophical. This is actually something where my physics background led me down a path of thinking, because one of the things that happened during lockdown was a physicist from Johns Hopkins University called Sean Carroll did a series of podcasts about the basic ideas in physics. And one of the things he said is, how do we know what's true? And he was talking about Bayesian approaches and quotation from a principle about being able to put your trust in something only as far as the evidence you have. And it kind of suddenly hit me that this is the basis of user authentication. User authentication is basically addressing a truth claim. I am Ant. How do I demonstrate that? And we've got to evaluate all the evidence. And how can we quantify the level of trust we can put in that identity claim based on the evidence we have? And the evidence we're usually using is, have I provided the right password? Have I generated an OTP from the token I have? Am I presenting the right biometric trait? But we can look at other things. We can look at things like device identity. We can look at things like behavior. And we've got behavioral biometrics, how you type, how you gesture on the screen. We've got more gross behaviors in terms of how you broadly interact with systems, how you navigate pages, things like this, which are kind of characteristic of the individual. And certainly there are differences between a human and a bot in the way that they navigate through systems. There are even differences between a legitimate user and a human attacker, because a human attacker will generally be more precise about what they do. An attacker will know what to do. They're following a script. They know exactly where to move on a page to perform their attack. Whereas a human user, a genuine user, is vaguer. They're thinking about it. They're making mistakes. So there's a difference in patterns. Not necessarily that this is Ant rather than anybody else, but we can say this person who claims they're Ant is behaving like a genuine user rather than behaving like an attacker. So there are lots of signals that we can bring in. There are lots of things which historically have been part of what we used to call more broadly fraud detection, account takeover prevention. So there are various things there, and behavioral biometrics were kind of part of that, but there were other things as well in terms of location and device and the behaviors, the patterns over time of different things, which are taken into account there. And think, well, they were basically designed to say, oh, if I see something anomalous, that's probably an attack, that's probably fraudulent, so I should do something.
It's interesting that so many organizations treat fraud detection and IDTR as separate domains, even though they're looking at the same signals that could strengthen authentication decisions. It feels like we've artificially siloed things that should be working together. Why is that separation a problem, and how should organizations rethink the relationship between authentication, fraud detection, and identity threat response?
In more recent years, we've seen interest in identity threat detection and response, which again is evaluating a lot of signals about behaviors as users traverse computer systems. And that's kind of carved off because it's part of this ITDR idea. It's been lots of companies focus on this. There's been lots of acquisitions here and saying, oh, this is all ITDR. And it's something which is its own thing. But these signals are exactly what we need to fold into those decisions about that claim of identity. Carving them out as a separate thing, I think, is a challenge. And we need to pull these together. So they're kind of the same signals. You can look at this in the light of these other ideas. So it's like we're looking through different lenses at the same core data and events. But my feeling is, because I was the authentication specialist, I was kind of greedy. I wanted everything to be about user authentication. But genuinely, if you have all these signals, thinking about them as ITDR or fraud separately from user authentication is just going to diminish the value you can leverage from them. You've got to think about this in terms of which of these signals supports the identity claim and which of them detracts from that. Does this look more like the genuine user, or does this look like an attacker? And this goes back to Sean Carroll's ideas about weighing the evidence and saying, what set of signals, including legacy credentials, but also all these things about device behavior and so on, what set of signals supports the contention that this is the genuine user and which support the contention that this is the attacker. And that's the only way I think you can make a decision about authentication. So even if you're saying, I've got these strong credentials, I've got my passwordless, phishing-resistant, FIDO2 device-bound passkeys that I'm relying on, that gives me a lot of evidence in the first instance. But other things which say there's something amiss here, other aspects of this login which make it look more like an attacker that's compromised that somehow.
Traditionally, as I understand it, authentication has been a front door event. You log in, you're trusted, and off you go. But the way you describe continuous authentication flips that on its head. Trust can increase or decrease as the session unfolds. So how does this continuous model change the way we think about security, and what does it enable that older models simply could not do?
When we take this approach of weighing up all these additional signals, we're also enabling something that we can't do with legacy authentication methods, MFA, in a classical sense. We're able to do this continuously. User authentication traditionally has been a gateway event. When somebody logs in, we're making an evaluation of the degree to which they trust them, and we're demanding a level of authentication based on what is the highest risk thing they could do past that point. If we say that's just our starting point, that just gives us a stake in the ground. If we're evaluating everything else that we can understand about the context and how people behave throughout the session, then we have something which is much more robust. And we have something which is a defense against, for example, session hijacking attacks. But it's also something that can get back to, how can we enable passwordless authentication? I've heard people claim they've done this, that they've used signals-based approaches going back many, many years. I heard this through a vendor. One of their clients had used this signals-based approach, and that was all they were doing for initial login. They weren't asking people to even enter a password initially. They were saying, I recognize the device you're coming from. So they're saying, yes, you get access to the system. Once you start to do something, we're evaluating the risk of that. That's a separate evaluation, saying, now if this is a certain level of risk, now we're going to prompt you to do something. This idea of tailoring the friction to the level of risk allows you to make things simpler for users in the first place and only force them to do something when the level of risk is higher. So you need to elevate trust accordingly. But at the same time, if you're using the right quote-unquote signals, and particularly if you're using behavioral biometrics, you can start doing that continuously throughout the session. So you can log in with a low level of trust. This is often characterized as that trust decays. Yes, we have a high level of confidence at the beginning of a session, but later on, maybe somebody's hijacked that session, or maybe somebody else has logged into has come across an open session on your computer or whatever it is. So we can't really trust you as much. And we think about if we're using signals, then we can maintain that level of trust. But I think there's an even stronger argument if you're using behavioral biometrics, how you type, how you gesture, etc., etc. If you start doing that at a relatively low trust login with whatever factors you want to use, if you start using those behavioral biometrics continuously throughout that session, then you can actually increase trust. It is now 37 minutes into this session, and we have all this data that Ant, Steve, has been typing continuously. They've been moving their mouse. All these things fall within norms for these users. We have a high level of confidence that this is an uninterrupted activity by this particular person. So by the time it comes to doing, I want to access some sensitive data, I want to make a high value financial transaction, we have a high level of trust, which is likely sufficient. So the idea of having to do trust elevation or transaction verification at that point, we've already satisfied. We might still do that in certain circumstances, but the idea of using these signals on top of traditional credentials allows us to maintain high levels of trust, but actually provide much better user experience. There's also the notion of being able to evolve things continuously over multiple sessions. I was talking about looking at things continuously throughout a session, but there's also the idea of continuity across multiple sessions, that you're building up a stronger and stronger picture of that user's behavior and able to analyze anomalies with higher confidence. If you have that continuity across multiple sessions, it's not just increasing the confidence in the identity claim, it's increasing the confidence in your decisions. If you're using this approach where you're evaluating signals, and particularly behavioral biometrics, throughout a session so that you don't need to ping the user, don't need to prompt the user to elevate trust explicitly when risk is high.
I find the psychology of security fascinating. It's part of my background, and especially the idea that too little friction can actually make people uneasy. Sometimes we want a prompt or a challenge because it reassures us that the system is paying attention. How do you see friction as being used intelligently, not as a burden, but as a way to reinforce trust and intentionality in high-risk moments?
There are still reasons why you might want to do things. One is that absence of friction is not necessarily always a positive user experience. Because if somebody is doing something they know is risky, like a high-value transaction, they want to feel that something is going on that would stop a potential attacker. If they could do something without being challenged, they might then worry that somebody else could as well. So it's a bit of security theater, but the idea that you have to reassure people that there is security behind what they're doing is part of the psychology of security. And there's also the notion, which I think the NIST digital identity guidelines highlighted, of intentionality, that if somebody can slip into doing something without any additional friction, where is your assurance that they meant to do that? So having a challenge to say, it's a kind of "are you sure" thing. And you could have explicit "are you sure" statement before you do something. But again, you're getting confidence that this is something that somebody had really thought about and committed to by passing that kind of challenge. So there are reasons why a totally frictionless approach may not be desirable, even if the technology enables it.
Ant Allan, former VP and analyst at Gartner. Let me just say what an absolute pleasure it has been to talk to somebody who literally has their finger on the pulse of the future of security. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Thales Security Sessions podcast.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. As you can imagine, I could go on about this at much greater length. So thank you for giving me some time to share my thoughts.
Remember, if you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe and tell a friend and a colleague or a client and your favorite AI agent about the Thales Security Sessions podcast. Not just for the next one, but for our collection of highly useful and very relevant past conversations. We will be back again soon with another episode and another discussion on the topics that you need to know about to successfully carry on in the business of information security. Until then, I'm Steve Prentice. Thanks for listening.